And the UN says we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction, probably in the next 20 years. And they said it 2 years ago, so I guess now it's the next 18 years. It makes a nice headline, gets lots of attention, but it is not an option for us. Those are the species that keep us alive on planet Earth. So the goal here is to get people to take that seriously. We have to make sure this doesn't happen. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, upon all of our houses. But that's not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that will take small efforts from lots of people. People like you and me. But those efforts have delivered enormous physical, psychological, environmental benefits to everybody. We'll turn briefly to this headline. It's a apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Go back to P.O. Wilson. He told us what it would mean if planet Earth lost insects, and he did it way back in 1987 with this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. And again, his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, that would so drastically change energy flow. There were terrestrial ecosystems, the food webs that support our animals. Amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. This food web would collapse and all those animals would disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients, and all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans won't survive any of those drastic changes. There is some good news, and that is none of that has to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We're totally dependent on that life support that is produced by ecosystems. We call them ecosystem services. Here are just a few things that plants do that are pretty important to us, like produce oxygen, like clean our water, slow its journey to the sea after it rains, where it becomes too salty to actually use. Carbon capture, enormously important today, pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, locking up, through photosynthesis, locking up the carbon molecule in plant tissues, but even more important and underappreciated, they're pumping carbon into the soil through their roots. Big plants, little plants, as long as they're alive. Our soils can store 7 times the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere right now, if we got it back into the soil. That's why our soils are brown or black, because of the carbon that plants have put there over the years. Plants are also preventing floods, they're dampening severe weather, they're converting sunlight into food. If we lost our plants, we have to eat sunlight. That would be hard. What do animals do for plants? They do lots of things, but really importantly, they provide pest control services, keep things in balance. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services is just not a good idea. Never was a good idea. Today it's a terrible idea because of the 8 billion people that we have. We need more ecosystem services today than ever before. And we do have parks and we do have reserves. And that's what they're supposed to be doing. They're doing the best they can, but it's not good enough. We wouldn't be in the 6th great extinction event the Earth has ever experienced if they were enough. Which means we now have to practice conservation outside of parks and preserves. Everywhere. Where we live, where we work, where we play, where we farm, where we have museums, everywhere. Now, there have been visionaries who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth, and Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said is the oldest task in human history is to live on a piece of land without spoiling it. There have been indigenous groups who have been able to do that for a long period, but our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. They habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, completely wrecking an area, going to another area doing the same thing, not sustainable behavior. But Aldo Leopold had a dream. He dreamt that we humans actually were capable of developing what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use that. We had to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all of those things. But he believed we could learn to do them gently, that we did not destroy local ecosystems. That's what he called a land ethic. And he wrote about it in the same County Almanac, his most famous book. What he did not ever talk about was developing a land ethic where we actually live. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist in the same place at the same time. That notion is so deeply embedded in the culture of our Leopold's day. And unfortunately, it's still embedded in our own culture, but he may not have recognized it as an option. So what I want to argue this evening is that not only is living with nature an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to flip that on its head. We now need to practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much it. In other words, we've got to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. Not hang on by a thread, but thrive. Where should we start? Well, let's go back to private property. If we don't do conservation on private property, we're going to fail because most of the land is privately owned. 85.6% of the country east of the Mississippi is privately owned. 78% of the entire country is privately owned. So we can't ignore private property. Now, when I talk about doing conservation, I'm not really using the word correctly. We do want to conserve any bits of nature that are left out there, absolutely. But I'm really talking about restoring areas where we've removed most of the natural. You call it restoration biology, but somebody will say, well, you're never going to put it back exactly the way it was. And they're right. We changed too many things, but it doesn't mean we can't reunite enough of those specialized interactions so that you have functioning ecosystems again, even if it wasn't exactly what was there 300 years ago or 700 years ago. We can recreate ecosystem function. But not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally. So we have to focus on the big contributors, the ones that are contributing the most first, and then we can add the other species later on. And there are two groups that we can't do without. One would be the flowering plants. They're capturing energy from the sun and turning it into food through photosynthesis. And of course, the pollinators that allow those plants to reproduce. So now we have the food that supports all the animal life on terrestrial Earth locked up in plants, mostly in plant leaves. Well, we got to get that to animals, but you don't have any animals. If you don't have any animals, you don't have a functioning ecosystem. Most vertebrates do not eat plants directly. Most vertebrates eat something else that ate plants. Invertebrates, primarily insects. And it turns out it's not just any insects that's driving these food waste. Caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant food. So if we design landscapes that don't have a lot of caterpillars in them, which has been the goal of landscaping for the last century, then you have a failed food web and a failed ecosystem and a failed planet. So let me give you a few examples of why caterpillars are so important. I'm going to start with the Carolina chickadee. This is a chickadee. That's the bird, one of the birds that's at your feeder all winter long, eating seeds, and you tend to think that's what chickadees need. Fill the bird feeder and they're happy. Well, during the winter, 50% of their diet is seeds. Only 50%. The other 50%, even in the wintertime, is insects and spiders. But when they go to reproduce, which happens to be an important part of their life history, they're maybe standing seeds at all. So they have to switch entirely to insects and vertebrate spiders too. But if they're in a healthy environment, they will really rely almost exclusively on caterpillars. And they are not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds rely on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. How do I know that? There's a number of lines of evidence that support that. But this is a citizen science project. You got seats right up front here. Citizen science project that Ashley Kennedy, one of my students, did a few years ago. She put out a call to bird photographers around the country. And she said, please take pictures of birds when they're carrying food to the nest. Did anybody contribute to that? Well, a lot of people did. She got thousands of pictures. The object was to identify what is in the beak of the bird as it's carrying food to the nest and recreate the nestling diet for as many species of birds in North America as she could. And she did. She got thousands of pictures. She did a lot of identifying. And this is a summary of her results. The green bars, you're looking at 20 families of common birds in North America. The green bars are the percentage of those nestling diets that were caterpillars. And in 16 out of the 20 common bird families, caterpillars dominated the diet. So again, imagine what would happen if we designed landscapes without enough caterpillars. Most of our birds would not be able to successfully reproduce. So something is special about caterpillars. We need to talk about that. There's actually several things that are special about caterpillars. And one of them is very simple. They're soft. So think of this guy's at least little soft. With a very thin wrapper. The wrapper is exoskeleton. It's made of chitin, which is undigestible. The birds don't want a lot of that. Because they're soft, you can stuff a caterpillar down the throat of your offspring without fear of injury. Then if you've ever watched the parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. It's like a plunger, they just stuff it down. Caterpillars are also relatively large predators. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. And many of our smaller birds do chase aphids around. If you want to chase 200 aphids, you get one caterpillar. They are nutritious, very high fat, very high protein, very low percentage of chitin, of exoskeleton compared to many other types of insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are very common, but they're not like little sausages, they're like little tanks. Which means that most of the beetle is undigestible. And many beetles have a lot of sharp edges too, so it's hard to step in. And finally, it turns out that caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. I mentioned carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate. You're a vertebrate. Birds are vertebrates. We vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids. So we have to get our carotenoids from plants. And we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. Where are birds getting the carotenoids from? Particularly during the breeding season, they're getting from what they eat, of course. But look, carotenoid content is not equally distributed among bird prey. Those two tall bars over there on your left, those are caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than other types of bird prey. The adult caterpillars, the little butterfly sign down there, the adult moths and butterflies have far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating green leaves. That's where the carotenoids. Only the caterpillars eat green leaves. And here's the earthworm way down here on the. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids. So that study and a number of others are suggesting that caterpillars are not optional parts of most bird diets. They're essential parts of most bird diets. So let's just say most birds eat caterpillars. The next question is, how many do they eat? One or two enough? Maybe one or two a day? Well, that's a good question. So let's go back to chickadees. A lot of data on chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of chickadees? One or two is not enough. 1 or 2 a day is not enough. It takes 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to get one nest of chickadees, one clutch of chickadees to the point where they leave the nest. And after they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days. But they're flying all around, so nobody's been able to. But you're really talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars to make one clutch of a bird that's a third of a nest. That's 4 pennies worth of bird. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, and I would think you do because in so many places, don't have is our yards. You have to have those caterpillars in your yard. Because chickadees forage about 50 meters from the nest. They're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And that is true for most of the birds. They forage very close to the nest because they're making a trip once every 3 minutes and they can't afford to be flying. That uses more energy than they get from what they find. And if we landscape in a way that does not support all of those caterpillars, that's called insect decline. And it's really looking like insect decline is one of the major reasons that people are measuring bird declines. We went to the original data set of Rosenberg et al. That's the Smithsonian group that said we've lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. And we divided the terrestrial bird species into 2 groups. The bar over the left is the birds that require insects at some point in their life history, typically when they're breeding. And the bar on the right is the birds that do not require insects. So things like finches and doves, crossbills, just a few birds actually make a milk out of seeds, and they can reproduce on seeds. They don't need insects. Well, the group that doesn't need insects didn't lose any numbers at all in the last 50 years. But the group that requires insects in some part of their life history lost on average 10 million individuals per species. So it doesn't prove cause and effect, but it certainly does suggest that as you take away bird food, you lose the birds. Science is pretty good. Which means we need to change our goal, add to our goals of landscape. In the past, we've had one goal of landscaping, and that is to make pretty landscapes. And it's a wonderful goal. But now we need to make pretty landscapes that are also ecologically functional. We've got 133 or 135 million acres of residential landscapes. A lot of land that we can't just erase and say that doesn't count. They have to have functional ecosystems on them too. And you're not going to do that unless you have caterpillars in your yard. So how do we add caterpillars to our landscapes? We do that by adding the plants that support caterpillars, which seems pretty easy. There is a catch though, and that is that most plants do not support a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about it. We have to focus on the plants that do support a lot of caterpillars, and we have to be fussy about it because the caterpillars themselves are fussy about it. And the monarch butterfly, not special. He's like 90% of the other caterpillars that are out there, but it's a good example. You're not going to have monarch butterflies unless you have milkweed. You can have all the boxwood, all the crepe myrtle, all the burning bush, all the ginkgos, all the things we typically landscape, and you won't make a single monarch butterfly. That's called host plant specialization. And it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. You got to have the plant they specialized on over the eons. Why do plants or caterpillars have to specialize? They're specialized because plants have made them specialized. Plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their tissues with nasty tasting chemicals. Secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world, which is why it's green out there. It's not because there's no insects out there that want to eat those plants, because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They're too well protected. But we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? This is where the specialization comes. 90% of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. It means they can only eat the plants for which they have very specialized adaptations. Specialized enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds. They can eat them without being poisoned. Specialized behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize the caterpillar's exposure to those compounds. It takes a long time for all those adaptations to fall into place. And once they do, the insect's locked into eating that particular plant lineage. Which is why if you take the milkweeds out of your yard and replace them with hostas or anything else, the monarch's not going to start to develop on your hostas. You can't do it. It's locked in the milkweed. So then it has two choices. Fly away and find milkweed someplace else, or starve to death. Those are the choices we've left. And by the way, I guess you heard that last week, IUCN listed the monarch as an endangered species. We didn't do it in this country. It's not an endangered species list, but they recognize monarch has lost 75%, 85%, or 95% of its population, depending on which population you're looking at. And in California, 99+% of the monarchs are gone. That's certainly time to list it. There are three kinds of plants. There are plants that contribute energy to local food webs, plants that do not contribute energy to local food webs, and plants that actively detract energy from local food webs. The best example for a plant that's a contributor would be one of the oaks. They're contributing more energy than any other plant genus in the country, possibly than any other plant genus in the world. I'm going to use ginkgo as an example of a non-contributor. Think of it kind of like a statue. It's just sitting there. It's not detracting energy, other than it's taking up space. It's something that could be making energy, but it's not an invasive species. It's not displacing nature. So not calorie pair, it is an invasive species. Highly invasive ornamental that is still used a lot. That's what it looks like when they escape. I mean, I could drive from New York City to Richmond when these guys are in. So you're taking a plant that doesn't support the food web and removing the plants that do. It's actively detracting energy from the local food web. So all I'm saying here is that plant choice matters. If we're going to restore ecosystem function, we're going to have to focus on the plants that are contributors a whole lot more than the plants that aren't contributors. And we've got to avoid the detractors as much as we can. I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well it works when you do focus on the contributors. Starting with our house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. That's where my wife Cindy and I moved in the year 2000 into a farm that had been broken up into 10-acre lots that had been mowed for hay before we moved in. That's what it looked like when we moved. Not much there. And our goal was to restore biodiversity on this property. We didn't know how to do it, but that was our goal. But as my research continued along, we realized, hey, caterpillars are important. We've got to bring caterpillars back. Well, how do you do that? You put those caterpillars. I said, I'm going to get the Canadian outlook breeding at our house. Now, this was early on. I didn't know that was going to work. That's what the adult Canadian owl looks like. And people say, why did you choose a Canadian owl? Because I looked at Dave Wagner's book of caterpillars of Eastern North America. So that's a pretty one. Let's get that one. Well, you're not going to have Canadian owls unless you have meadowroot. Just specialist on meadowroot. Just like monarchs need milkweeds, Canadian owls need meadowroot, and we didn't have any. No meadowroot anywhere around us. It used to be there, but our area had been heavily farmed for 300 years. So no meadowroot. So I got some meadowroot from someplace else. Planted it. It grew very nicely. But this was early on. And I actually had very little faith that Canadian owls would be able to find my little patch of. So I planted the seeds, the plants grew, but I didn't even go out and check. It must have been 2 months later. I walked by for another reason. I looked over, covered with Canadian owls. You'd find it right away. I'm still surprised about that. So it was a big success. Now we've got a good population of meadowroot and a good population of Canadian owls. We've added 2 species to our property that weren't there before. The restoration has begun. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. It's actually a misnomer. Nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a specialist on that plant, Biden's aristos. Beautiful yellow moth. We'll call it the goldenrod stowaway. We didn't have any Biden's aristos, but I did know where there was a patch 14 miles away in a power line cut. So I went, got some seeds, planted it at home, grew very nicely. Had to wait a year for the goldenrod stowaway to find our Biden's. Some people call it ditch season. But they did find it and have a good population of Biden's and goldenrod stow. As a matter of fact, I planted the Biden's aristos along my rock wall in the front. It didn't want to be next to my It wanted to be in my front yard. It's a wonderful patch of Biden's with no, but that's it. Same story with the hackberry emperor. So there we go. We've added 4 species to the property. Hackberry emperor. I wanted this to be at our property because it should be there, not because it's the most beautiful butterfly, but it's a species that belongs there. But as its name suggests, it's a specialist on Celtis on hackberry. We didn't have any hackberry, and there's a nice hackberry in the parking lot. So I planted hackberry. I had to wait 4 years for the butterfly to find hackberry. Finally did. Good population of both of those now. So that's 6 species we've added. That's how it went over the years. I didn't plant goldenrod. It came in on its own, but along with it came a lot of things that depend on goldenrod. Like the brown-footed owlet, the Arcidra flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginophus, the goldenrod gall moth. The goldenrod flower moth is one that has not come. Not sure why it hasn't come. I think it actually means early goldenrod. We don't have any early goldenrod, but it's still part of the fun. It's anticipation. It's like waiting for the catches to come out of the bottle. That's what the caterpillars look like. And every year at the end of August, I go out and look at those caterpillars. One of these years I'm going to find them. That'll be a great thing. I planted Virginia creeper. Do you see?
We don't need to plant.
I've heard that. I've heard that people don't like Virginia creeper, even though it's called.
But we don't need to plant.
Oh, you don't need it. Yeah. Don't plant it on your house. But otherwise, it's a great baby. It can climb your trees without girdling it. It's got good fall color. It's a good ground cover. It makes really nutritious berries for the birds in the fall. They're high in fat. That's what migrating birds need. It's a great pollinator plant, believe it or not. Flowers are tiny and inconspicuous. You don't even know it's in bloom until you see this cloud of native bees. Remember, when you're making a pollinator garden, you're making for the pollinators. If it's not big and showy to you, that's okay. I planted it because it's the best plant to support the large sphinx vase. They're a primary component of cardinal diets. Things like the Pandora sphinx, beautiful adult, the avid sphinx, that's the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the avid sphinx, all on Virginia Creek. Want to see if I get the evening primrose moth at our house because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. Believe it or not, we had no evening primrose. Even there, so I planted that. Moth came, spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. It's very cute. And I planted lots of oak trees. And these are just examples of the plant lineages we put back. But I want to focus on oak squirrel because they're such important plants. That's the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York. Martha Stewart. It's a very famous tree. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous. And I hear people say, I am not going to plant it because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if you can only enjoy your oak when it's 400 years old, you're right, you won't. But if you can enjoy what your oak is delivering to your local ecosystem, you can enjoy it right away. And I can say that with confidence because I planted most of my oaks as acorns, which means they were pretty, or 2-foot bare root webs, which means they cost $1.50 each. And immediately they start to rebuild the food web by attracting the mostly moths. A few butterflies on those, but it's mostly moths that are creating the caterpillars that drive the food web in our yard and lots of other yards as well. Things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Jubilee's dusty wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, Suzuki's chromolactus, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-pumped oak worm, the orange-humped oak worm, the pink-striped oak worm, the hesitant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, crown view, the latrix, the orange-pad smoky wing, the white blotch heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red lion panicota, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of moths come to the oaks on our property, and they come right away. There's a pin oak just popped its head above the leaves, and here's a caterpillar standing in the ground. You don't have to wait decades or hundreds of years for the oaks to start to support the food web function. That's what our house looks like from the same place I took that original picture. Except that patch of lawn there is now by design. So what I realized when we learned how important caterpillars were to local food webs, I said, I'm going to count all the caterpillars that occur at our house. Big job. It's taking me 5 years. I'm still doing it. And by counting, I mean take a picture. If I don't have a picture of it, I'm up to 1,181 species. I got one last night. 1,181 species of plants. Now, 30% of them are oaks, so we should be planting for oaks. We have 10 acres. Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So in 1/240,000th of the landmass, we've got 44% of all the moths that occur in the entire state. And because so many of those are types of bird food, that's the drab prominent from the sycamores that we've planted. We've recorded 60 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres, not flew by, but bred. Why am I telling you that? This is another headline we see all the time. World Wildlife Fund said we've lost 2/3 of Earth's wildlife since 1970. Terrible statistic. But I'm thinking, not at our house. I am convinced we have put back more than 2/3 of the biodiversity that was lost there. And it wasn't that hard, and it didn't take that long. All we did was put the plants back. What would happen if everybody put the plants back? So yeah, it seems like a no-brainer. But we have 10 acres. Will it work on smaller properties in suburbia? That's a very good question. Let's go to Margie and Dan Terpster's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. They live in a typical suburban neighborhood. All their neighbors have the big lawns. When they moved into their property, which is 0.6 acres, so 18 times less land than Cindy. It was totally choked with bush honeysuckle, armor honeysuckle, so another invasive ornamental. So they got rid of that. They planted 75 species of native plants, put in a water feature that they call a bubbler, and then they sat back and started to count the birds that are using it. And they're up to 149 bird species that use it very regularly, including 35 warbler species. And just to put that in perspective, we've only recorded 8 warbler species. So does it work on smaller properties? Absolutely. What about urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago, and I mean in Chicago. That little gray tower you see way back in the distance, that's O'Hare Airport. She lives right next to the airport. She has 1/10 of an acre. That's 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. And she's not connected to any natural area at all. It's a pretty 1/10 of an acre. And I will admit, this is a landscape designer with native plants. She's good at it. But she did the same thing. She got rid of her non-native plants, put in 60 species of native plants, a water feature, and then she sat back and started to count. And she's up to 124 bird species that have used her yard, including a woodcock. This Pam's woodcock. She sent me that picture to brag about her. So if you haven't seen a woodcock, we go to Pam's house and she. All right, 4 things we need to think about if we're going to succeed in a big way. We do need to succeed in a big way. And one of them is pretty obvious. We've got to shrink the area that we have in lawn. I used to say we have 40 million acres of lawn. It's up to about 44 million acres of lawn right now, which is an area bigger than New England, dedicated to an ecological deadscape. Why do we have that? There's 2 reasons. It's a status. So, and we humans need our status symbols, and we also need area to display our Halloween. We plant half of the area that's in, let's say we got 40 million acres, we plant half. Let's take an area like this and turn it into an area like this. This is a slide Dan Getman sent me. I don't know who Dan Getman is, but he's a guy in Missouri who said, look, I'm doing it. I'm putting natives back in my. And I said, great, I'll show that picture. Well, that would give us 20 million acres that we could put towards conservation. And if we did it at home, we'd create a new national park. It would be 20 million acres in size. And I'm calling that homegrown national park. And it'll be big. It'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badland National Park, Olympic National Park, plus Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. And if all this park is still less than 20 million acres. So homegrown national park is the biggest park. What do we get when we put a park at home? What do we get when we put some part of nature right at home? We get the opportunity to develop a working relationship, to get to know Mother Nature. You know, maybe we did that. Maybe we had a good relationship as kids. Our people our age often did. Our kids, they do not. But we need to rekindle that. How do we do that? You need to do that to develop a personal relationship. And we could do it at our own time and our own pace if we've got nature right in our yard. Maybe we just go out in our yard, or maybe we just look out the window. That can be good enough. You can avoid crowds. You know, if you go to a real national park now, 375 billion people there with you. If you get in at all. It's free. There's no admission fee. It's never closed, no matter what pandemic comes down the pipe. No travel hassles. The important thing is you get to experience nature alone, which I think is essential to developing that personal relationship. It's particularly essential for our kids. Richard Lewis says they're all suffering from nature deficit disorder because they haven't had any exposure. So we're trying, we get 30 kids, we put them on a bus with a teacher and they drive for an hour and they walk around for an hour in a natural place. The teacher tells them not to touch them. And they get back in the bus and they come, and that's their experience with the natural world, which I'm sure is better than nothing. But it's really been an experience with 30 other kids and the teacher telling them not to touch it. Let them go out in the yard alone. Get to know Mother Nature on their own terms. I'm going to focus on alone. They will come home again. You know, when we hover over our kids, we are sending the message that this is dangerous. You know, that this is dangerous, or I don't trust you, or something bad's going to happen. That's not the message we want to send to their kids out there interacting with the natural world, because they are the future stewards of planet Earth. If they don't know that, if they're afraid of it, if they don't know how to steward, they're going to be lousy stewards. We can't afford any more lousy stewardship. And maybe they will learn how to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own grandmother. So who lives in Hawaii on a very modest patch of nature, a little piece of lawn with a hedge. And I mean little. But there are no lizards. And when she discovered that, she sent me this picture to describe how you hunt lizards. You get on the ground and you cover yourself with leaves and sticks so the lizards don't see you coming. Now, there's no smiling because this is serious business. You crawl very slowly toward the lizard. You can wear your best dress, but you sneak up on the lizard, you catch the lizard, you put it in a ring, you learn how to take care of that lizard. You fall in love with that lizard. You learn how to be a good steward of that piece of nature. Now, I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground the rest of her life in her best dress catching lizards. I don't think. She better this pictures of it. But I guarantee she's going to remember catching lizards and go wild. I guarantee it's going to help her be a good steward of the planet. If you want your kids to do more than catch lizards, get Nancy Striniski's nature play at home. Dozens of examples of how to expose kids to the natural right with it. And if you want to join Homegrown National Park, you can do it now. Go to our website, homegrownnationalpark.org, and register your property on the map. What do we mean by that? It's free, by the way. What you're doing is you're saying, okay, I own this piece of property, and I'm committing to reducing my lawn by this much space there, or I already have reduced my lawn by this much, or I put in this many oak trees, whatever area that you're being a good steward of, even if it's putting one aster in a flower pot, you're on the map. Then your little area of your county is going to light up. We're working with a tech company now so that you can see it. The whole country will light up. We get to see how it fills in, where we need to convince more people to build biological corridors. We've got about 19,000 people on the map at this point. I don't know what the acreage is. We need a lot more than that for sure. But we're using social media here to reach the non-choir. People are saying, you just talk to the choir. It's only the choir that invites me. So we're trying to use, everybody loves social media. We're going to join the conservation tribe now. We're all going to belong and have the same goal of putting the world back together again. We think some people will be attracted by that alone. That's the goal. So we're going to shrink the lawn. What plants are we going to put back in the area that was once lawn? I'm going to argue that some of them have to be what I'm calling keystone plants. Remember what a keystone is? That's the Roman arch. The keystone is the stone in the middle of the arch. If you take that keystone out, the arch falls down. Well, if you take keystone plants out of their food web, the food web collapses because they're making most of the food. Just 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. So think of the keystone plants as the ecological house that you're building. It's the food web works. They're holding up the house. They're essential. You can't build a house out of wallpaper. That's what we've been trying to do for the last century. You're not through building your ecological house when you get your keystone. It's an essential component. So the question is no longer simply, are natives better than non-natives? Ecologically, on average, they are. But on average, there are a lot of natives as well. So at least in the beginning, we want to focus on best contributors. We want to focus on the best contributors, the ones who are supporting the most caterpillars and the most pollinators, or not. I mean, that's really the question. What is the best contributor in terms of making caterpillars? It's one of the oaks. In 84% of the counties in which they occur in North America, they're the #1 keystone plant. In the Mid-Atlantic states, that includes Virginia, they support 557 species of caterpillars, over 950 nationwide. No other plant genus comes close to them. And if you want to know what the best keystone plants are, you go to Native Plant Finder in the National Wildlife Federation website. You put in your zip code and the ranked list of both woody and herbaceous plants that are best in your county will pop up. This is just an example. The list is much longer. Notice on the right here, Solidago, asters, helianthus, sunflowers. Those are not only the 3 best herbaceous genera for making caterpillars, they're also the 3 best for supporting specialist bees. When you're making a pollinator garden, you want to focus on the specialists because the generalists use those plants as well. If you only plant for generalists, you've lost all the specialists. If you have any species of goldenrod and the native asters and helianthus, you can have over 40 species of native bees on your property that won't be there if you don't have those plants. This is a very powerful way to build your pollinator garden. All right, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants. We're going to invite a lot of insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security, which is not the goal. But that's what we're doing. There's research, a lot of research showing that light pollution at night is one of the major causes of insect decline. And those are all the reasons, all the ways that kills it, particularly those moths that create those caterpillars that drive. This is good news because we've got to turn around insect decline, not just stop it where it is. We got to turn around and rebuild insect populations, the little things that run them. And if we can do that by flicking a switch, that's easy. Now, there are a lot of switches to flick, but it's easy to do. But I know what you're going to say. I can't turn the light off over my garage or over my barn or over my front porch because of it. Okay, I'm going to put a motion sensor on it so it only turns on when the bad man does. And the first thing you recognize is the bad man doesn't come very often. And if you don't want to do that, even easier is take the white bulb out of your security lamp and put in a yellow bulb. Yellow LED is the best because insects are far less attracted to yellow wavelengths. So that's a very quick, easy way. If we replace our white bulbs with yellow bulbs overnight, we would save millions of insects and also millions of dollars if we use LEDs. So we're going to shrink the lawn, we're going to use keystone plants, we're going to turn out our lights, we're going to use yellow lights, and then we're going to invite Mosquito Joe. Booming business all around the country. Remember when Zika virus didn't come? Mosquito Joe took off. But he says it's okay because what he's fogging there is a natural product, and it is. It's pyrethroids. It's industrial strength pyrethroids, but that's the same compound found in chrysanthemums. But remember, cyanide is also a natural product, so I think that's a good argument. He also says it only kills mosquitoes, and I wish. Kills all the insects it comes in contact with, including monarchs. Big monarch killed hundreds of dead monarchs on the ground 2 years ago when we flew through Mosquito Joe. The ironic part of this is it does not control mosquitoes. You don't control mosquitoes in the adult stage. You control them in the larval stage. In order to control mosquitoes in the adult stage, you have to kill 90% of the mosquitoes. And Mosquito Joe kills between 10 and 50%, which is why he has to keep coming back and you have to keep paying him and you keep having mosquitoes. If you really want to control mosquitoes, try mosquito ducks. Everybody thinks this is my product. It's not. It's out there. This is Bacillus thuringiensis, natural bacteria that only kills aquatic diptera. So what you do is you get a bucket and you have to go bucket. I don't care. Bigger the better. Get a bucket, fill it full of water, put in some kind of organic matter. A handful of straw or hay, some old leaves from last year. Grass clippings probably work too. Now don't stuff it so full, but just you're adding organic matter that will create algae and diatoms. And that is what mosquito larvae eat. And it becomes an irresistible brood of female mosquitoes that are flying around looking for a place to lay their eggs. They will lay their eggs in your bucket. Then you throw in a mosquito dump that you got at the hardware store for $9. And mosquito larvae eat. They hatch, they eat the mosquito dung, and that bacillus kills them. It's very targeted. If a dragonfly gets in your bucket, it doesn't hurt them. If your dog drinks it, it doesn't hurt them. If your kids drink it, it doesn't hurt them. You might put a screen over it so that the chipmunk doesn't jump in the ground because they like to do that. But it's a targeted, cheap way to really knock down that mosquito population. And if everybody did it, it would work. If you have a whole lot of mosquitoes and no breeding sites that you can see, and you're saying, well, this just doesn't work. Check the sewers. If you've got street sewers, it's always about an inch of water in those. Nobody thinks about it until a lot of mosquitoes come out. Throw a mosquito dung down. But here's a real cheap way. You keep the mosquitoes off you when you're sitting in your backyard trying to have a party. Just create a little fan wind and they can't fly into it. It works. Okay, the fourth thing we need to do is to landscape in a way that allows caterpillars to complete their development. If they don't make it through to adults, it's not going to work. What do I mean by that? Well, here's an example. I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the Polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree itself. The caterpillar eats the leaves, it spins a cocoon and hangs from the branches, then it emerges as an adult, and it does it all over again. I wish everything did that, but most species don't. Most species finish growing as a caterpillar, and then they drop from the tree, and they spin a little Well, they work their way underground and pupate underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the tree. And that's the problem. There isn't a leaf litter under the tree. We don't tolerate it. We like it neat. And we mow and compact the soil so it's rock hard and those caterpillars can't get underground. And I'm convinced that this type of landscaping, even if we use the best trees, actually, especially if we use the best trees, becomes an ecological trap. We pull in the adult moths, they lay their eggs, caterpillars develop, and then drop down the farm. And of course, the cement landscape is not going to do it either. This is what most people do. We have a tree in a lawn, and I actually have a grad student who, as I speak, is on her hands and knees following caterpillars that have just matured as they're looking for ways to get underground, so she can see what it takes for homeowners to allow caterpillars to get underground. Maybe they can do it in the lawn, but I guarantee they're going to do it better in a situation like this, a layered landscape. You have your tree, but then you've got maybe a dogwood and then native azaleas and ferns and ground cover, leaf litter under there. The soil's not compacted. Nobody's going to mow them. Nobody's going to step on them, and they can easily get underground and keep it. This is where you can do your spring ephemeral gardening next to your trees. It's a great way to reduce your lawn. After you reduce your lawn, plant a tree and put a big bed. These are safe sites, soft landing for those caterpillars. This is how you use your ground covers, things like wild ginger or native pachysandra. There's Virginia creeper being a great ground cover, golden seal, mayapple, foam flower, ferns. There's all kinds of options to remove the lawn and make a productive landscape. The caterpillars are going to really enjoy. Another grad student, former grad student, Desiree Naranga, did some great work with chickadees, Carolina chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And she had one question that led to the idea that there's actually room for compromise in our plant choice. She asked whether or not chickadees, how well they survive in a landscape that is dominated by native plants versus the landscapes that are dominated by typically non-native ornamentals. And when they were dominated by non-native ornamentals, they produced 75% bird catch. So right away, you had 75% less bird food available for those chickadees. Those landscapes were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. They all had nest boxes up, but chickadees would come and look around and say, there's not enough food here. I'm going to try to reproduce. If they did try to reproduce, they laid 1.5 fewer eggs. Those nests were 29% less likely to survive. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to do that. And if you put all that information into a population growth model as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plant biomass in your yard, from none to 100%, this is what you get. That dotted line up there is replacement. That is the rate at which the population has to make babies in order to replace the adults that die every year. Chickadees don't live very long. And if you reproduce at that level, if the population reproduces at that level, that's a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you make more babies than adults die, anything above that dotted line, then you have a growing population. But if you have fewer babies than adults die, then you have a shrinking, unsustainable population. You can see where those lines overlap. It's right around 30%, which suggests you can have up to 30% of your landscape non-native woody plant biomass without destroying the local food web. Now, there's no room for invasive plants. They're ecological tools. They escape and they castrate our natural areas. But there's plenty of ornamentals that are not invasive. Remember Dan Getman? That's a ginkgo. Why does he have a ginkgo in his native land? Because his wife said, I want a ginkgo. There it is. Is it destroying his native plant and the productivity of that yard? No, it's not. It's not invasive. It's not moving. It's not taking that much space. It's just there. It's not contributing, but it's not destroying it. So it's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs. It's the absence of those contributors, the native plants that are contributing most of the energy. If we get more of them into our landscapes, we can tolerate some of the beautiful ornamentals that really cap off our landscapes. Can we use native plants in formal designs? Of course we can. This is a Lynn O'Shaughnessy design taken from a drone 400 feet up. Every plant in that Very formal landscape. You don't get more formal than that. Every plant in that landscape is a native plant. So formality is a function of the design, not of the plants in the design. And afterwards, we're going to walk around a little bit and talk about some of the ways we could get some more productive native plants into a very formal Virginia design. That's what we have right here at the museum. Can we get a pollinator garden into a typical yard like this without offending anybody? Sure we can. Put a little fence around it. It formalizes it. Tells your neighbor it's not just a bunch of weeds you forgot to mow. It's pretty when it's in bloom. It's meeting the needs of a number of species of bees. It's not very big. It could be bigger, but if everybody did it, it would help a lot. And remember why we need pollinators. Now you hear all the time we need them to because they pollinate a third of our crops. It's actually about a 12th of our crops. I don't like that argument because people say, well, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. Forget the crop argument. We need pollinators because they pollinate 90% of all flowering plants, 80% of all plants totally. We lost our pollinators, we lose 80 to 90% of our plants. That is not an option. Where do we need pollinators? Everywhere we need plants, which is everywhere. What about this? That's a Drew Latham design, much bigger. Imagine the amount of life in that garden right there versus the amount of life in the lawn next to it. Again, it seems like a no-brainer. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Yes, they can, and more of them are doing it. Minnesota is one of the first, has a cost-sharing program to encourage homeowners to reduce or totally replace their lawn with appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. Very popular. There's an island off Florida that's paying residents to allow burrowing owls, listed species, to burrow in the front yard. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, in my opinion. With carrots rather than sticks. If you have an endangered species on your property, we're going to pay you to take care of it rather than fine you if you use your property. Everybody would want an endangered species. Put a bounty. Put a bounty on things like calorie bear or other invasives. That's what St. Louis, Missouri did, Fayetteville, Arkansas, South Carolina has banned them altogether. North Carolina, bounty on them. If you take down calorie bear, you get a free treatment. Water utilities are giving people $100 coupons to put in water efficient native plants instead of non-natives. Of course, the big lawn reduction programs in the West, particularly California, let's come up and get $3 per square foot rebate for every square foot of lawn you take out and replace with a zero. And if you want to know more about those programs, memorize them. All right. I think we made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. The first one's a serious one. We've started to think about nature as if it's optional. We like it. We like to visit it. We like to watch it on television, but we don't need it. It's a form of entertainment, which means when push comes to shove, when resources are in short supply, which is always, nature takes a back seat. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out. Actually, I went there after the virus broke out and got COVID. That's where I was. And there's this poster there that to me epitomizes our society's view of conservation. We want to save nature, save wildlife for future generations to enjoy. It was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for supporting the national park system. These are beautiful, wonderful places, and we want future generations to enjoy them. But that reinforces that idea that nature's there just for our own entertainment. It's much more important. We need nature so that we have a little bit more important. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. We talked about that, but if we confine conservation efforts just to areas where there's not a lot of humans, we're going to fail because those places are too small and too isolated from each other. David Quammen has an excellent analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. That is a functional Persian rug. That is not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which is acting on. And that's what we've done to our ecosystem. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. I don't like that language. It suggests there are places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. There are certainly places where we have destroyed the ecological significance. But it's not true. Every square inch of the Earth has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including our roots, including much of our agriculture. So we need to glue our rug back together again, folks. We got to put the plants back. not just to make biological partners that connect viable habitat, but to recreate viable habitat that we destroy. We're starting to do that. It's happening more and more. And when we complete it, when we do it, it's going to be the first time in modern history that we really are coexisting with nature, where we live, where we work, where we shop, where we play, where we farm. Everything. Our third step was to leave Earth stewardship just to a few specialists, a few conservation biologists, a few ecologists. For some reason, we didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of every person on the planet. But I don't know why, because everybody on the planet depends entirely on the quality of local ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody have a responsibility of taking care of those ecosystems? Stan Rushworth, the Cherokee elder, once said that the Western settler mindset is, I have rights. Mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with those mindsets, you're taught them. We're good at teaching the I have rights part. We've been terrible at teaching our kids and our peers that we all have obligations to good Earth stewardship. That does not mean that you have to save biodiversity for a living. But if you save it where you live, it empowers you. You know, the Earth has really serious problems now. People are looking at the entire planet and saying, there's nothing one person can do. Well, don't think about the entire problem. There's plenty one person can do. And when you realize that, you are totally empowered. You can shrink the lawn. You can turn out the light. You can fire a mosquito jug. You can put in a pollinator garden. You can remove the invasives that are already on your property. We didn't even talk about that. You can use keystone plants. One person can do all those things, totally revitalizing the ecosystem right where they live and contributing to their local ecosystem rather than detracting from it, which is what most of our yards do. And when we think of it that way, it shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Again, don't think about the entire planet's problem. You will get depressed. Just worry about the piece of the planet you can influence. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a park or preserve or land conservancy. They're all underfunded. They're all understaffed. They will love you as a volunteer. So as a property owner or a volunteer, each one of us has a responsibility to fix dead landscapes. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own fate. I think I've convinced my grandchildren that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Yes.
Do you have to take care of the pollinator gardens the way you would like any other garden, where you have to weed it and fertilize it and mow it or trim it?
Complicated question. Native plants, native gardens are not maintenance free. First of all, you have to install it. That requires time and energy. A lot of people say, well, how much have you spent putting all the plants back on your 10 acres? And I thought about that. We went to a nursery once. It was going out of business. We probably spent $200. That's it in 20 years. Everything else is what I just collect seeds or put in myself. So it doesn't have to be expensive. But it does require maintenance. And most of the maintenance comes from keeping out the ones you don't want, keeping out the invasive plants. So you didn't plant it, but they'll come in anyway. And that's where the energy goes. Do you have to mow it? No. If you've got a well-planted yard, you're going to reduce your mowing for sure. Do you have to fertilize it? Not at all. Our native plants, most of them don't like fertilizer. We can kill them by too much fertilizer. When you choose the right plant in the right place, you don't have to water it. You do to get them established, but after that, they're very good on it. So a well-designed native landscape is less maintenance, but it's not maintenance free. At our house, 99% of our maintenance is keeping those invasive.
I have a question on invasive. So I'm in the process of getting rid of a lot of invasives in my yard, and I've been prioritizing those that are spread by the birds. I think, for example, Japanese barberry or even English ivy or mahonia, because I know that they can go into the forest far away. But what about Vinca minor that's only minorly invasive? How is that spread? Is that just through rhizomes, or is that also spread through the birds and I need to move it out one of the areas?
No, I think as far as I know, it's spread vegetatively. So yeah, that wouldn't be my top priority either. You know, I like to see the biggest difference. So I pick the biggest woodies, autumn olive, multiflora rose, and go after them first. You get a big open space.
Unfortunately, I don't know.
Really?
No.
Good for you. You know what's porcelainberry? Do you have porcelainberry yet? Yes, you will. It's the kudzu of the north. It is terrible. And then of course stiltgrass, which is impossible. So you got to pick your battles. But to me, getting rid of the big woodies that are shading out other things is my target. Yes.
You described the deer problem, the deer overpopulation problem really, really well. Too many deer that won't eat the invasive, they'll eat the natives. Do you have any good strategies that you've seen working with deer overpopulation? We've got it here.
Yeah, you know, the entire country has overabundance of deer from coast to coast at this point, but it's certainly really bad in the east and really, really bad in the mid-Atlantic states. I need permission from the herd of deer in my yard to drive out the drive, particularly in the winter time. You know, by the way, we're talking about invasive plants. The deer go hand in hand. Many of our native plants, we said they're not as competitive. They are as competitive. The deer exposure experiments have shown that, where Trillium outcompetes garlic mustard when you do get rid of the deer and it doesn't eat it when it's this small. Every time an oak tree comes up, the deer eat it. So of course they're not, you know, when they're in a deer's belly, they're not going to be able to compete with burning bush. So controlling the deer is really step one to controlling the invasives in our natural lands. We know how to get. We know how to do this. It's the social problem that we decide not to do. That becomes a sociological issue. It's curious to me. I don't want to go too deep because it, you know, the Fed raised the interest rate today. They didn't ask me. Why didn't they ask me? I'm not an economist. I know nothing about it. They didn't ask me because that makes no sense. Why do we allow people who know nothing about deer control or ecology making decisions about whether or not we get to control deer? There's something that doesn't make sense there. And that's why we got it. We've also created, you know, we've got too many deer because we got rid of all the deer predators. And we also planted a perfect habitat, deer-like edge habitat. Now everything is edge. So we've created perfect conditions and got rid of the predators. It's not the deer's fault that there's too many. But no population does well when it grows forever. You know, it's destroying the forest. There's no recruitment. If we let that happen forever, then we're going to have nothing but invasives in the forest anymore. So for the good of the deer, for the good of everything, for the good of our ecosystems, for the good of our health, of Lyme disease, we've got too many deer. We've got to control the deer. And we know how to do it. Yes.
It's still absolutely possible. Do you actually believe that, or is there anything you can do?
No, I don't. Do I believe it? Just come to my house. Annual. So you can say, well, if you keep it mowed and you do that for 6 years, you can get rid of the seed bank. Well, they make seeds at the top, like other grasses, but they also make seeds down in the axils that are underneath the mower. So even mowed stiltgrass will make seeds that come up the next year. Plus, look how fast it invaded if you have it. I'm convinced that the deer burn because there's nothing that's moving seeds around that fast other than deer. So maybe they're eating a little bit and pooping it out. I don't know, but it went from nothing on our house. We moved in 20 years ago, none, and maybe 2 or 3 years, all 10 acres solid. So that's not wind dispersal. Although that happens too. We've got a covered bridge with a roof. There's still grass at the top, and the deer didn't put it up there. So it's really good. No, we don't know how to control it. I would love to see serious money go into plant diseases that control plants. Look at how well the chestnut like controlled the chestnut. It works. That wasn't the goal, but it works. But nobody wants to deal with it because diseases, you know, mutate really fast, as we know. But I think, or that or a biocontrol agent, but people have looked, there's really nothing that eats it anywhere. So I don't know what to do about stiltgrass. Yeah.
Question in our virtual chat asking if you could speak a little bit more about the role of birds in the food web.
Birds in the food web. You mean, what good are birds? So, yeah, I get that question a lot. Usually not birds. It's what good are houseflies, what good are, excuse me, what good is the bleak. There was research a long time, theoretical research that said the more species in an ecosystem, more stable and productive an ecosystem. Robert McGarthy said that in 1955, and then he got some kind of cancer, got right after that. So he never got to test it. Very difficult hypothesis to test. He did call it the law of nature, though, and people bought that for a long time. Well, over the decades, now probably 15 studies that have big long-term studies that have tested that simple hypothesis. As you add species to an ecosystem, is it more productive, making more ecosystem services, and is it more stable? The answer is and every time you take a species away, you weaken that productivity and that resilience. So what good are birds? First of all, there's a lot of them, and they're very common. They disperse plant seeds really well. They're food for things higher on the food web. They control, we got those caterpillars and they're making a lot of them out there. They control them, they're well eating 300 plus a day. So they're keeping things in balance, but they're important cogs in that wheel. So there's a lot of things that are out there, and maybe some are more important than others. They're also really beautiful. A lot of people love them, so that in itself is important. But I've heard people say, I don't want any birds in my yard, they poop on my car, and they make too much noise. So people have different views. But the real answer is all the species are important to keep our ecosystems intact. We've lost so many of them. And I'm not talking about the Smokies where you say, well, it's still got a lot of species. That means that ecosystems. We need healthy ecosystems everywhere. Our yards too. How many species are in our yards now compared to before it was our yards? Just a fraction. That's what homegrown national is. Getting the species back to increase the resilience and the productivity of everything, including birds. Yes.
Are there any dramatic examples of where you have multiplying species been achieved? Dramatic, the big buildings this is spectacular.
Now, I thought my 1,180 species of bugs and the 60 species of birds breeding on this was dramatic.
You didn't invite a Phil. Yeah.
I got too much stuff. It's a good question. But, you know, I talk about our house because it shows that you're starting from a blank slate. You really can put a lot of it back pretty quickly without a tremendous amount of effort in a short period of time. I think that's pretty true. Yes.
You know, when you want to start changing your landscape into natives, you don't have to do it all at one time. You could do a little 2 foot by 6 foot thing like you showed there. You can manage that. Check it, you know. We've done some, we don't do a lot of landscape installation, but we have done some that people who are in their 60s, and I say to Janet, you know, who's going to take care of this? Because we can't, we don't have the labor. Why are they doing so much, you know? And, you know, and they are having trouble with it, and they stopped calling us because.
Yeah, but you know, you bring up an excellent point. Most people don't garden at all. What do? They hire a lawn care.
Yeah.
So we need to create a new, build this niche, we'll call it ecological landscapers, so that the people who don't garden, they don't have time, we've got busy lives, gotta do their email. They just call the ecological landscaper who installs it, they know how to take care of it, so don't worry about a thing. We will create ecosystem services on your yard, and it'll be beautiful. You won't be thrown out of your neighborhood. That's what we need. We need those people. Anybody who's looking for a good career. That really, everywhere I go, people say, who can I hire?
Yeah.
And I typically say,
There are websites here in Virginia that have lists of people that do exactly that.
there you go.
And then-
But everywhere we need more. Yes.
I just want to throw out a resource for invasive species management. Blue Ridge Prism stands for the Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management, blueridgeprism.org. has all the information you could possibly need about stilt. They just had a webinar for an hour and a half on stilt grass alone. And there are ways to deal with it. Very little use of chemical or mechanical uses, but they are a huge resource for invasive species management.
I'll have to look them up. By the way, the flamethrower, you know, that works too, but you have to, yeah. Okay, one more question, and we'll take a little while. Yeah.
So you've developed your caterpillar population. When you take concern about them eating up your host plants to the point where the plant is destroyed?
When you see that happening, and you know when I've seen that happening? Never.
Okay.
And it's those birds that are eating most, not just that, there are literally thousands of species of natural enemies that are mostly other insects and little wasps or parasitoids. When I try to take these pictures, particularly of adults, after rear the caterpillar through, to get an adult of a saddleback caterpillar took me about 5 years because I could not collect one that wasn't parasitized. It was going to be killed by a little wasp. So that's what's keeping things under control. The time the caterpillars defoliate and cause big problems is when they are non-native caterpillars, things like gypsy moth, spongy moth. The winter moth, all these things are in the Boston area where they come in. So I'm not talking about that. We don't want any non-native insects. The emerald ash borer, these things are devastating because they're here without their natural enemies. But our native caterpillars, even though we have things like tent caterpillar and fall webworm that cycle, and sometimes it's a lot, and sometimes they'll be fully eat your black cherry, and it'll be back in a month. You won't even know it. But there's very little in tree or bush mortality from native insects. They're all under control.
Thank you.
I want to thank you all again for joining us. And a big thank you to Dr. Tallamy for taking the time to speak with us and talk about the wonderful work that you do. We'd like to give you a little gift as a token of our if any of you are interested in purchasing one of these fascinating books, they will be available for purchase after the program. And if you have any questions that were not able to be answered tonight, if you email those questions to the info@nationalreporting.org email, then we will make sure to send it along to Dr. Tallamy. And programs such as this one is a really big honor for all of us here at the NSLM, and we are really excited by the recent launch of our capital campaign in June that will allow us to continue inviting exciting and dynamic speakers such as Dr. Tallamy for years to come. And if you'd like to learn more about how you can contribute towards this goal, please seek out our Director of Development, Peter Kleiner, and she'll be able to answer any questions that you have. And if you're not already a member of the NSLM and would like to join, you can sign up online through our website, or you can reach out to one of us after the program and we can help you with that. As a member of the NSLM, you can receive free admission to the exam, special access to this and discounts on events and programs, as well as inclusion in the NSLM's sporting bibliophile. So once again, I'd like to thank you for joining us.